Hi, I'm Sara Campbell from Upbeat Piano Teachers, and you're listening to an episode of the Musicality podcast.
Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, founder of Musicality, and welcome to the Musicality podcast. On today's show, I'm talking with Sara Campbell, an accomplished piano and singing teacher based in Pennsylvania. I met Sara when we were gearing up to launch our instrument packs at Musicality. I was searching for someone who excelled in bringing joy and creativity to the process of learning piano, and really understood how to develop musicality, not just instrument technique. I was delighted when she accepted the position, and she's been doing a terrific job inside Musicality for several months now. But as you'll discover in this episode, that's just one example of a variety of cool and interesting projects she's involved with. In this episode, we dive deep into how to get started with playing by ear and improvisation. Sara shares insights and specific tips that can be applied on any instrument, not just piano. She recommends one particular activity you can try today to get started improvising, and the essential warning you need to hear if you want it to go well. She also reveals a powerful way to flip your understanding of the piano keyboard and to see it in a whole new way. Something that will be useful for anyone who occasionally dabbles on the keyboard, not just the devoted piano players among you. I always love talking with Sara because she's such a wonderfully positive and creative person. As you'll hear in this episode, she has a real knack for making difficult or intimidating things totally approachable and keeping enjoyment at the heart of music learning. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. My name's Christopher Sutton, and this is the Musicality podcast from Musicality. Welcome to the show, Sara. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Christopher.
I would love to start at the beginning and talk about your early days in music. How did you first get started?
Oh boy. So I've got some good stories for you. and I hope that my mom and dad listen in on this because they'll be entertained. My first memory of being musical is when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I was asked to sing a solo at church. And my parents, they had seen me singing around the house as a little kid, but they had no idea that I would have such a love for singing in front of an audience. And I went up there, zero fear, 5 or 6, and sang an entire song by myself. And that's the first memory I have of becoming musical.
Wow, that's brave as a 5 or 6-year-old, and also brave of your church music director to put a 5 or 6-year-old up there. You must have really wowed them.
She was actually my piano teacher at the time. I had just started taking piano lessons from an organist, so I had some interesting habits in my first year of being a pianist, and I think she realized I could handle it.
Terrific. And so what were those early years of piano like? You were learning with a teacher. Was it fairly traditional, kind of classical piano based on note reading and repertoire and perfecting things for exams? Or what kind of teaching was it?
It was pretty traditional. I started in the Bastion series, which a lot of people out there are familiar with. And I don't remember ever doing any improvisation or that kind of thing. I wasn't being prepared for exams, but I did get to do small recitals and things like that.
And did you enjoy learning piano? I ask because not all kids do.
I loved it. As a young kid, I absolutely loved playing. I would find these pieces that I would play over and over and over again, and to the point where I'm sure that I was annoying some people in my house. I didn't feel like it was a chore when I was really young because it was so cool that I could make a song on the piano. That concept to me was so awesome. So it was, I can learn this and I can learn this, and then I can show other people what I can do.
Fantastic. And you mentioned there that improvisation wasn't really a part of your learning back then. Were you doing any playing by ear as you were learning piano?
My mom told me a story from when I was little that I was playing by ear, even though I didn't realize it. That even before I started taking lessons, she actually tried to teach me herself for the first few months. And of course, it's very difficult for a parent to teach a child a lesson that's just an instrument. I mean, it's just very difficult. But I was kind of plunking out little tiny things that, like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I think it's very natural for children, if they sit down at an instrument, even if they don't have instruction, especially a piano, because it's so visual. It's pretty natural for a child to start plunking little things out like that. So I guess I was one of those students.
Great. I love that description of it, plunking things out. As you would know, at Musical U, the approach we teach to playing by ear is very kind of practical and trial and error. We don't pretend you're meant to magically get it on the first try every time. We kind of show you that's the route to playing by ear, and it's figuring things out more than it is immediately knowing how to play it. And I think that's great to think of it in terms of that childhood willingness to just try things because you want to see if you can do it.
Absolutely. I think as we grow, we start to lose that willingness to experiment. And as children, if we watch children, we know they're not afraid of making mistakes because that's part of the learning process. They are experimenting and seeing, okay, what happens when I do this? What happens when I do that? As adults, we're afraid to do that because we're so terrified of getting things wrong.
And it sounds like you weren't in that kind of, I was about to say brutal, that's maybe overstating it, but that very rigid exam treadmill of piano learning where you are thinking about being note perfect, because if you're not note perfect, you won't get the points in the exam. Is that right? You had a bit more kind of freedom and flexibility to retain that willingness to experiment?
That is right. I never actually did exams. My younger sisters did exams, but we moved around quite a bit in my family. So I had a variety of piano teachers. And I think because I was a transfer student so many times, maybe the teachers did do exams, but they were more concerned with just making me comfortable and getting to know me as a student and just learning new pieces. So it was just about having fun and enjoying the process of playing.
And I believe you had a particular genre of music that introduced you to playing by ear a bit more intentionally. Could you tell us about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to remember exactly when this happened. It was probably 8th grade. I started getting into a lot of Celtic-inspired music. So I was a big fan of Enya. It's funny to me now, but and beautiful music. Enya and Yanni and quite a few others. But there was this one CD, I think I got it for Christmas maybe from a parent or an uncle or aunt, and it was called Celtic Destiny, which is just a
inspiring
fabulous title.
To an 8th grader, I'm sure.
And I would listen, and that was the year that I bought my very own CD player. Now, I know some of our listeners out there are going, CD players? What's that? But I had saved up $100 and I bought my very own 5-disc changer, and Celtic Destiny was on the rotation. And I would listen to it all the time. And I just one day decided to sit down to the piano and try to figure out one of the pieces on there. And I did, slowly but surely. It took me a really long time to figure it out, but I did. And I was so pleased with myself that I could listen to something and recreate it.
Wonderful. And was that something you then did more and more, or was that a one-time experience because you were particularly infatuated with that one piece?
I'm trying to remember because I don't have specific other songs that jump out in mind. I do believe that I figured out little tiny snippets of things, but that was the first piece that I figured out in its entirety. So I actually could play from beginning to end. But for other things, I think I would just like pick out a little tiny part of a song and I would plunk out the melody and go, hey, look what I can play. You know, maybe it was like a little snippet from like a video game, or, you know, I was more into like the computer games back then. So things like that, or a theme from a movie. Mm-hmm.
I love that scene of you experimenting at the piano because, you know, I grew up in I wouldn't say a very musical household by nature, but we were encouraged to do music, and me and my sisters all learned instruments, and my parents were super supportive and always, you know, complimented our playing and that kind of thing. But the nature of the lessons we were taking meant that I think we were all too self-conscious practicing at home to do that kind of experimentation. You know, I would have been a bit embarrassed to spend 30 minutes trying to work something out, because the expectation was I'd go to the lesson, I'd learn how to play it, and then I'd kind of perfect it at home. And so I guess I wouldn't say I'm jealous, but I think the way you describe it, it should be really inspiring to our audience, because I think that's an attitude you can take even as an adult, fresh. Like, that's something anyone can bring to their instrument and say, it doesn't matter if I sit down for 30 minutes and I've still only half worked it out. You know, that's fun. You know, that's what I want to do today. And I don't need to worry if someone's listening or not.
That was actually, I love that you brought this up, because this was a big thing for me as a child. Now, on the piano, I wasn't quite as self-conscious when people were listening to me play. As a vocalist, my parents, once I hit middle school, my parents swore that I just never sang. Yet I would land the leads in musicals, and then they'd see me up on stage and they'd go, "Oh, she can sing." Well, that was because I was waiting for those moments when everybody was out of the house. Mom and dad, dad was at work. Mom was taking my sisters to karate class, or, to Girl Scouts or something, so that I had downtime and I could be myself and experiment on the piano or to sing. And, as adults, sometimes it's hard to find that, that downtime when we can just, be ourselves and experiment. So I always encourage, because I have some adult students and a lot of teen students, I always encourage them to look for the moments when people are out of the way, that they're not there. And even if it's like a 15-minute session when mom runs down to the store, take that time and use it.
I think that's great advice and very practical advice. I would love to see us as a society have more of a respect for that experimentation and dabbling. I think if we all had in our head that the great musicians spent hours and hours working things out by ear, we'd have a very different idea about doing it ourselves. We'd sit down proudly to experiment for half an hour rather than sheepishly worrying someone's listening.
Oh, I love that you brought that up. Yes, exactly. I think that nowadays we are such a YouTube society, and like Facebook video society, that we only see the polished results that people have worked on, and we have no idea how many takes it took to get that one perfect video. Mm-hmm. It would be it's refreshing to see people nowadays with Facebook Live. It's really interesting. There are some musicians out there that will go live and just improvise or practice. My sister is also a pianist. She did a session on Facebook last night where she just literally sat down and she practiced on Facebook Live, and it was fantastic.
That's a great example to set. I love that. So you went on to decide to devote your life to music and to become a piano teacher. How did your willingness to experiment and improvise develop? Was it a gradual process? Because that's now something you incorporate into your teaching. Was there a pivotal moment for you, or a teacher who particularly showed you the way?
I will be honest. Let's see. I have been teaching now. I think I'm approaching my 12th year. And for probably the first 6, I never taught any improvisation. I was kind of terrified of the concept. I had dabbled with it on my own in high school and a tiny bit throughout college, but because I went into music as a professional, maybe, going into a college and getting a degree, I was such of the mindset that I really had to follow this path, one foot in front of the other, and not to go too far off of the path. So I was afraid to go away from the method books. I followed the method books like a religion. And eventually I started noticing, I had some students who were really bored, and I was getting bored. You can only teach, Frere Jacques so many times before you get really irritated. And that's when I started to branch out and seek out other people, other teachers who were focusing on improvisation. And I would, read their blogs and I'd watch their videos and think, okay, this doesn't look that hard. I'm going to give it a try. And I started picking out a couple of students who I knew would be open and receptive to that kind of instruction. And that's when my teaching totally changed.
And can you remember now any of the particular websites or resources you were looking at then that inspired you to think this might be possible for you too?
Absolutely. The first one that comes to mind was Teach Piano Today. I think it's Andrea Dow. She was coming out with these little books of improvisation exercises where, she provided a chordal structure and perhaps a couple of measures in the treble clef in the right hand. It would just be left blank, that the student had to come up with something within a certain parameter that would sound good with what was already provided in the chord structure. And that's kind of how I got started with this. And then there were some other people like Tim Topham, and of course, Bradley Sawash now. That is another person who I love to watch his improvisation. It's just fantastic.
Wonderful. And I'm a mediocre piano player myself, and I know that it takes a very different mindset to sit down and play from sheet music or play something you've memorized versus sitting down and seeing that keyboard as kind of your palette or toolkit to work with. Was there anything that helped you kind of see the keyboard in a new light or to find that freedom for yourself that you were then going to try and pass on to your students?
There are a couple things that come to mind. First, there was another resource by Forrest Kinney called Pattern Play. And I love this series of books. It's absolutely fantastic. It's really, really good for anybody who has studied piano for a little while and has a pretty good understanding of reading music, but feels very uncomfortable with anything when it comes to improvisation. They really broke things down into small bites. Like, these are the different things that your left hand might be able to do. These are the different things that your right hand might be able to do. Look at this scale. And instead of just having a scale written on the staff, they had scales written out on the keys. And to see that was very different for me. At the time, there were not a lot of resources out there that showed a scale as like dots on the piano. And that was something that really opened my eyes to the different possibilities. When I was younger, I actually quit. Can I tell you a crazy story?
It's just you and me, Sarah. No one else is listening. You're fine.
Oh, that's right. Nobody else is listening. Okay. I quit piano lessons when I was 14. I wasn't, that's a rough age. That is just a rough age. And I had just moved into town. I tried to connect with a new piano teacher and it didn't really work. We just weren't on the same wavelength. Definitely not her fault, probably more my fault, but I quit lessons for a number of years. I did get back to it when I was 17, but while I took that break, I started to explore the piano on my own. And that was when I really started thinking about going to college and majoring in music. And one of the requirements of the audition that I had to do was to play all of my scales and pentascales. So I sat down at the piano one day and I had a basic understanding of scales. I had learned a lot of them, but you kind of learn them, okay, here's a C scale, here's a D scale, and, here's a G scale. But you don't think of how they relate to one another. So I sat down and I started trying to play through my pentascales chromatically. So starting with C and then moving to C sharp and then D. And all of a sudden, I started noticing this pattern on the piano of half steps and whole steps. I was aware of it before. I'm sure that my teachers taught me, okay, here's where the half steps occur, here where the whole steps occur, but I had never really seen it on the piano. And I started seeing this pattern of black and white emerge and how what was white becomes black, what was black becomes white, and then looking out for those tricky little half steps that occur between E and F and B and C.
Interesting. So just in case anyone listening isn't familiar, can you just explain the difference between a scale and a pentascale?
Absolutely. So a pentascale is the first 5 notes of a major scale. So with a C scale, it would be C, D, E, F, G, and that's the pentascale. It fits, as pianists, we talk a lot about these major pentascales because they fit very nicely under the hands. We have 5 fingers, 5 tones. And so that's the pentascale. And then the major scale, of course, includes the upper 3 notes. So A, B, and C for the C scale.
Gotcha. Okay, so the reason pentascales are so popular with pianists is that we have 5 fingers rather than 8.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. So that's really interesting because I remember, one of the transformative things for me as a pianist and what helped me find a bit of freedom on the keyboard after lessons where I was just learning notes from sheet music was that visual connection with the keyboard. And I think in traditional lessons, you're looking at sheet music straight ahead of you. You're generally taught not to look down at your fingers because you need to be keeping an eye on what you're playing. And I think that leaves you very divorced from the visual layout of the keyboard in a way. And you mentioned something there, the dots on the piano kind of diagrams, and I love you've brought that to your role at Musical U when you're providing resources for our members there, and it's so powerful to just see on one page, this is the pattern for all the different pentascales or pentatonic scales or whatever you're teaching, to see that visually, not just as dots on the staff.
Yes, it's a big game changer because dots on the staff can be kind of intimidating. Especially, if I recreated, I think you're talking about the major pentatonic worksheet. That was one of the resources that I created for Musical U. If I recreated that as a scale on the staff, that could be almost off-putting for some people because it's difficult to read, especially if you're provided a key signature and you don't actually have the sharps and flats written in front of the notes. So I started doing this. That's not the first chart I've done. I started making these charts on my blog years ago, and they are actually the most popular resource. I think the first one I made was 4 or 5 years ago. They are the most popular resources on my site. People are always coming to download the different pentatonic scales or pentascales, and I think I discovered in my little break of piano lessons when I was just kind of fiddling around, I discovered I'm a visual learner. And I do really well with looking at a keyboard and seeing the pattern of what creates that scale.
That's so interesting. And I think it's interesting because a lot of people, if they were to see those diagrams, they'd think, oh, okay, that's just an easy way to learn the scales and to figure them out without having to decipher the treble clef and the key signature and so on. But what's so interesting about your story is it actually let you perceive beyond that, and you were seeing a pattern in your chromatic playthrough that made them make sense to you in a way that the pure sheet music hadn't.
Exactly, yeah. I didn't notice the pattern when I was looking at the scales, especially because when we're learning scales, oftentimes the scales are not all listed on the same page. A lot of the scale resources out there that students use only have one scale per page and they do a bunch of exercises with it. Being able to see everything in one space, looking at all 12 keys, that's when it clicked for me.
And what was that useful for? Why did that clicking help you as a piano player?
It helped me not only as a piano player, but as a vocalist. That's one of the reasons I wanted to learn things chromatically, because as we sing, if you're doing vocal warm-ups, we tend to do things chromatically. We certainly don't follow the circle of fifths with a vocal warm-up and jumping around from key to key. So that's what really helped me. And also being able to quickly think about, for instance, here's something that I found fascinating. I always used to kind of have trouble with the key of G flat or F sharp, whatever you want to call it, because it's a nasty key. It's a lot of black notes in that key. When I started learning things chromatically and I would have trouble thinking of that particular scale, I would flip it in my head and I would think of F major and I would visualize what it looks like on a piano, white, 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 black, white, 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 white. And then I would flip that and say, okay, so that one black key is going to be the only white key in G flat. And everything else is going to be black.
I think that's such a powerful example because that's not something you would spot. However carefully you examined the treble clef and the sheet music representation of the two, you wouldn't have that insight that they were related in that way, would you?
Right. So with the pentascale, it just inverses. It's like this mirror image, or not a mirror image, a negative image. So it's like looking at the negatives of a film. Now, at the top of that scale, that's when you have to start thinking about those tricky little half steps like E and F that are two white keys. So there actually is another white key at the top of that scale. I want to make sure that I say that. So
Fantastic. And so we've gone into some detail there. Let's step back a little bit. And this was helpful for you as you were approaching college and you'd recommitted to learning piano in your own way, having taken yourself out of the traditional lessons. How did you go on to explore improvisation or other more free and creative ways of playing?
Well, for a while, I focused in college. I was actually a vocal major, so I was focused on learning art song and arias and things like that. And yeah, that was fantastic stuff. As a pianist at that time, I did start exploring more classical music, but it wasn't until I was probably 26 or 27, and I was attending grad school, and my very first grad school class was a John Coltrane class. That was the first grad school class that I ever attended. It was one of the most fantastic experiences of my life, and I got hooked.
Fantastic.
To this thing called jazz. And once I took that class, I thought, okay, I'm going to fit as many jazz classes into my schedule as the order of classes will allow, because at that time I was a music history major, actually, or a master's degree. And so I took a Coltrane class, and then I took a jazz theory class. And that it blew my mind, and it made me really want to dig deeper into what is this stuff and how does it work. So I was able to take a semester of jazz piano lessons with an instructor at Youngstown State University, and it was extremely challenging for me because I had come from this totally like classical vein of reading the notes on the page. And, Dan, my teacher, would hand me this lead sheet, and I was terrified. It was like a totally foreign concept to me. It took me a long time to get comfortable with starting to explore that sort of thing, but I absolutely love it now.
So for any listeners who aren't, immersed in jazz or maybe are scared of the very idea of a lead sheet, can you just explain what's the big difference there? If you're already an accomplished piano player, why can't you play any music that's handed to you?
Right. So, on a lead sheet, what you have is you just have the treble clef that has the melody. So perhaps like if you think of a song that you might sing, like the first thing that comes to mind is the song Bye Bye Blackbird, a really great jazz piece. And in the lead sheet, it would just have the melody and it would be written out. But above that lead sheet would be these super scary things called chord symbols. And the chord symbols are a series of letters. And, some of the chord symbols are easy to understand. Maybe if it's a G, it's just telling me, oh, I have to play a G major chord. But then you have all these other things that can be written next to that letter, like a tiny M. What does that mean? Or like a 7, or like these weird little dots that look like degree symbols. What the heck is that? And so that's what I started to dive into, learning about these chord symbols and how to interpret them on the piano, and how to make music out of this little structure that you're given with a lead sheet.
Great. I remember when I first tried to learn from lead sheets, it was like a foreign language or some kind of impenetrable code. And I was laughing last week. I had an email from my sister-in-law who plays piano, asking me, she had this music and she was trying to play it based on the chord symbols, and there was a G/D. What did that mean? Was it a G? Was it a D? What chord was she meant to play? And, for me anyway, I really, because I'd been a note by note kind of piano player, I really had to step back a notch and try and find lead sheets that were just kind of major and minor chords, because I had to learn, if it says G chord, what notes is that? Like, what does that look like on the keyboard? And I kind of had to some time just with that very basic kind of pop rock lead sheet before I was even a little bit ready for the jazz. It sounds like you dived in at the deep end.
I did, yeah. Or I was pushed into the deep end. But it was a good way to get my feet wet. And then later on, when those lessons actually didn't last very long. It was just a semester. So I kind of got a taste for the different things that you could do. And Dan taught me some different patterns, rhythmic patterns that I could do with my left hand. I still struggled with wrapping my head around exactly what you just said. What is this G/D thing? Nowadays I'm always teaching these things. Actually, I teach that kind of chord symbols to my young kids. I was just teaching that a lead sheet. There's a great resource from Supersonic's Piano, which is from Daniel McFarlane. He's from Australia, and he came up with this series of small exercises that you can teach younger kids. And actually, I love these for adults because they sound so impressive in a very little bit of time. And all it is that it's a lead sheet and it has a chord chart above. And within the first 5 pages, he's already throwing this like G over D thing at you. And so you just learn to, start reinterpreting, okay, this is kind of how I'm going to invert this, and thinking about the ingredients inside of a chord. So if our G chord, I'm going to get technical for just a second. I like to think of chords as having ingredients in them. So let's talk about C, because C is a chord that most musicians are familiar with. A C chord, a C major chord would be C, E, and G. Those are our chord ingredients. Now, we can put those ingredients in whatever order we want. I always try to talk about chords like chocolate chip cookies, because everybody likes cookies, right? So if our chord is C, E, and G, and we have this chocolate chip cookie dough, we can make that into a regular round cookie, or we could maybe put all of that dough into a pan, press it all down, and then cut it into squares. It's still going to taste like a chocolate chip cookie. It just looks different.
Gotcha.
So that's how I like to explain to my kids when we have a chord that has that little slash and we're exploring inversions. Hey, it's still a C chord. So don't freak out. It's all right. But it's just going to look a little bit different because we're going to flip the order of our notes.
That's great. And one thing I love about that metaphor is it also covers what do you do if you encounter a chord symbol you don't understand yet? What if it has that little degree sign, or what if it has a slash something that you don't understand? And it's reassuring to know if you play, if you create some kind of chocolate chip cookie, that'll probably work. As long as you don't go off and do like an almond white chocolate monstrosity, you'll get away with it.
That's right. Stick to the basics there. When in doubt, if you don't understand all those chord symbols, just play the letter. Just play C, just a single C, and it's going to sound okay.
And I think that's a good pathway into the general improvisation mindset of not being too concerned if things go a little off track or if you make a mistake, as it were, and learning that as long as you're creating music that sounds pretty good, that's a win. Exactly.
I try to I have a lot of kids who are in jazz bands now, because jazz bands are big in our area, which is just awesome. And I try to remind them, my pianists, as they're learning, hey, you don't have to do it all. If you can just do those root notes, you're still contributing to a wonderful sound in this ensemble. So don't feel like you have to be super complicated when you're sitting down and you're improvising with other people, especially, because let them do some of the other notes and you just handle a couple and you're going to sound great.
That's great advice. It's funny, I have that inner self-talk that you have to get past when you're an improviser going on in my head right now. Like I mentioned that degree sign, and in my head there's a little voice going, but that would be augmented or diminished. You can't play a major chord there. It's going to sound bad. And, that's where you start out. You play the wrong type of chord, and for the next 3 minutes, you're not thinking about the music making. You're thinking about, I played a wrong note. And yeah, it's so liberating when you realize you can just ignore that voice and get on with the next thing you're doing.
Exactly. As people who improvise, we have to learn a quick forgiveness. So if you hit that wrong note, just whatever. It's fine. Forgiveness, move on to the next.
So for someone who's listening and feeling inspired by this, they want to go and sit down at their piano and dabble a bit. Do you have any kind of tips or tricks or little activities you would recommend for someone who's just starting out, wanting to figure something out by ear or improvise?
Absolutely. This is something that I really talk about a lot with, especially my teens, because teen pianists have gotten to a point where they understand chords, basic, major, minor. Some of them have started to explore seventh chords, but they don't quite know what to do with them yet. And it can be a frustrating point in the process to understand these things, these chords, or like the theory of them, but not knowing how to apply them. And so I start to encourage them to explore on their own, because I don't want to be the kind of person who spoon feeds my students. I want to teach them to feed themselves. So I tell them, okay, I give them a general little project. And what I say is this. I say, okay, think of one of your favorite songs. And maybe make a list of a bunch of songs that you really, really like. And then I want you to go out there. I want you to pick one of those songs and look up the chords. See if you can find them online. Because a lot of people get very intimidated with this idea of playing by ear, that they actually have to start from nothing. Now, maybe 15 years ago, you really did have to start from nothing, because we didn't have all of these websites out there that have all of the chord charts on them. But nowadays, we have so many resources at our fingertips. Go out there and use them. It's not cheating. It's learning. So go and grab a chord chart, from what's that one? Ultimate Guitar. Go there, look up the chords, and start just experimenting. You don't have to make it sound like the actual song. You can just learn the chord patterns and start experimenting with different rhythms in your left hand, and maybe in your right hand. Maybe you just play blocked chords. Maybe you just play thirds. Keep it simple. Try to create different patterns in your left hand, and all of a sudden you notice that the song that you really loved, that might have been a rock song, that's like heavy and, a lot of booming rhythms in it. You could create a new sound with that song with something very gentle. Maybe it's more flowing, broken chords and like a music box type of pattern. And all of a sudden you're creating music out of something that you already know. So start with what's familiar and comfortable, and then challenge yourself and try to make it sound a little different.
That's wonderful. In Musical You, when we talk about improv, we talk a lot about the idea of playgrounds and giving yourself kind of a safe space to experiment in, something that lets you, explore musical options in a way that will generally sound pretty good. And I love that idea of taking a song you like, giving yourself the stepping stone of knowing what the chord progression is and using that as a safe space to kind of play around and experiment with different things.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun when you start doing this. It's intimidating the first time you do it. I will let everybody know the first time you try to do this, you might get frustrated and you might feel like, this just didn't really sound good. But stick with it, because the more you do this process, the easier it becomes. I think that is the biggest issue with learning how to improv, is that people give up too easily because they expect that it's going to sound amazing the first time that you do it. Guess what? It's not.
It's not, and it didn't for anyone. Any of the big improv greats you admire, their first improvisation probably did not sound so hot.
Oh, no, not at all. Remember, those videos out there are totally polished. You're seeing the end result of hours and hours of work.
Yeah.
So when you are just starting out, practice forgiveness and just have fun. Think about, what would it be like if I were doing this if I were like 6 or 7 years old? If you can find that childlike mentality and curiosity, you are going to have a lot more fun, and you're going to be able to find that forgiveness very easily.
So speaking of younger students and having fun with music making, when I first came across your blog and your teaching, one thing that really jumped out at me was that you ran a pop and rock 145 camp in a summer recently. Can you tell us about that, what you were teaching and how you went about it?
Oh, this was one of my favorite summer workshops. We had so much fun. The concept was, it actually came out of a piano book. It was called like How to Rock Your Next Recital. And every single piece in this was a 4-chord song. So it was 1, 4, 5, and then of course our minor 6, the minor 6 chord. This progression that is super popular. If I'm going to give you guys a homework assignment if you're listening, because I'm a teacher and this is what I do. But I want you to go out on YouTube and I want you to look up the Axis of Awesome. Christopher, are you familiar with them?
It's a wonderful video. Yeah, we'll definitely put a link in the show notes.
Oh, they're just fabulous. And there are multiple videos. They've done many different videos of these 4-chord songs where they link together all of these pop and rock pieces. And actually, there's a lot of genres out there that include 4 chords. And they sing like a little snippet of one song, then go into another song and another song. And people start to realize, oh my gosh, all of these songs are the same. So that's how that workshop was born. And we started exploring the different possibilities with these 4 chords. What does it sound like if we rearrange their order? What does it sound like in a different key? What does it sound like when we'd use different rhythmic patterns? Can we make it sound soft and gentle and more like a ballad? And then we can make it sound amazing like a hard rock song. So I invited a couple of musician friends of mine. I invited James Williman, a guitarist, and Stephen Marks, a drummer, people who I'm good friends with. And they came in to our pop rock camp, and the kids that were in this camp, there were eight kids in this camp, they got to improvise with professionals. And it was a little scary at first, but I prepared them. The first couple of days, we spent a lot of time just learning these progressions and practicing different patterns. And on the last day of the camp, we had our pros come in and we just did a jam session. And it was super fun. There were lots of mistakes, but I had the professionals talk to the kids saying, hey, you know what? We make mistakes. And we've been doing this for years.
That's awesome. I wish every young music student could have that kind of experience, because if they did, we would not have so many adults that were terrified of the idea of a jam session. And, I totally get where that fear comes from, but I think giving them that early experience of, this is what it's like to jam with musicians. It doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be note perfect. It's just a fun way to enjoy music making. So you have incorporated this kind of creative, fun spirit into your own teaching, but you don't stop there. In fact, you're out there helping other piano teachers bring this kind of thing to their own teaching, and also helping them with the kind of professional development of their own studio. So along with Tracy Selly, you're part of the Upbeat piano teachers, and you help independent piano teachers with advice both on the music side and on the business side. Can you tell us a bit more about that, how it came about and what you do at Upbeat Piano Teachers?
Oh, great. Yes, I'd love to talk about this. This is one of my favorite jobs. I wear many different hats, and my Upbeat piano teacher hat is one of my favorites. Tracy contacted me. I think it was, it's like I think it was 2016, or it might have been even 2015 when we started. She had been reading my blog, and I was blogging a lot about teaching these summer workshops. So like the pop camp that we just talked about, and some other ideas, creative ideas that I was into, like creating movies with students, or doing a singing workshop. So she contacted me and wanted to interview me about how I did this. How do I set up these summer workshops? And Tracy and I just clicked. I mean, we just are of the same mindset. We're really out there wanting to share this info with other teachers. And so she asked me to join her full time with Upbeat Piano Teachers. And now we co-host together. And so she has like a background in broadcasting and I have a background in theater. So I'm pretty comfortable on camera. And we have a really good time. We interview piano teachers from all around the world on a variety of topics, whether it's about how to set up your business or, recently we just did a series about teaching teenagers and how to connect with teens, because that can be a really tough age. So not only were we talking about different ways to connect with them and to inspire practicing and to get students to be more self-motivated, but we also talk about music that they might connect with, or different ways, to approach teaching outside of the exam society, because that's a big thing now. How do I teach outside of exams? For a lot of teachers, it's very intimidating. And then we've done some other things. We do academies where we help people plan things for their business. And we do a lot of, we just started our group coaching. That was actually, we did our first group coach experience this summer, and it was fantastic. We did our Upbeat Planning Academy, and we worked with teachers for 6 weeks. And we just actually wrapped this up last week, worked with teachers for 6 weeks to help them plan their best year ever. And we really got into the nitty gritty of, organizing all kinds of stuff. And it was pretty amazing.
A range of help you're providing to piano teachers. That's incredible. And you're always popping up on my Facebook doing Facebook Live. That's part of Upbeat Piano Teachers too?
Oh, yeah. I love doing live videos. They used to be super scary, but I've gotten pretty comfortable with them now. Yeah, you can actually find me live on Upbeat Piano Teachers on Facebook. If you just look up Upbeat Piano Teachers, it pops right up. I go live on that particular business page every single Friday at around noon. Sometimes the time changes just a little bit, like it'll be like 12:10 or something like that, and that's Eastern time. But I always put out a post that morning or the day before where you can actually click a little button and get a reminder in your own time zone about when I'm going live. And I think I've done about 14 of these videos so far. We've been doing it for 14 weeks.
Wow. And you're talking about the kinds of things you just outlined, like how to connect with teens or how to include different activities in your teaching, as well as how to, have a successful piano teaching studio. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I try to cover a variety of topics, whether it is like a business tip or a teaching tip. I will occasionally do a video from the piano and actually teach, here's how you would do a very simple improv. Or here is how I like to think of teaching scales. Here's a little tip about, making it visual on the piano. So I like to do those things. It's really fun. And we have a lot of teachers who like to tune in live. So we get a really good conversation going in the comment area.
Awesome. And so I know we have a lot of music teachers and piano teachers in the audience. So if you're listening into this and keen to learn more from Sara, definitely do tune in for those Facebook Lives every Friday. So we were introduced by a mutual friend, Tim Topham, because I was looking for someone who had that kind of inner musicality and deep understanding of what it meant to be creative in your music learning and music playing, not just, play the notes on the page and pass your exams. And he recommended you as someone who really got that. You're now our resident pro for piano at Musical U. Can you share with the listeners a bit about what you do at Musical U and how you're helping our members there?
First off, thank you, Tim.
Yes,
I'm so glad that,
too.
because this has been super fun. I'm having such a good time at Musical U, and I really enjoy interacting with our pianists on the forum. We're having a good time getting to know one another, like little fun facts about one another that aren't even necessarily piano related, or, whether it's talking about, hey, what are you practicing this week? And as we continue, I think this is my fifth month, of being the resident pro there, kind of getting into a little bit of accountability. Hey, have you made any progress with this? How's that going? I had a lot of fun also creating the video resources every month. It's been a great learning process for me, actually, because, I love it when, Christopher, you'll throw like this topic at me and, and I'll go, oh, okay, so like this is a big topic. How can I create something that's like 10, 15 minutes out of this? And it's been a great challenge for me as a teacher. How would I filter this down to something that's super useful and not too overwhelming?
Well, you do a terrific job of that. You always find a way to make it very practical and fun, which is exactly our goal with those instrument packs. So, we're delighted with the resource packs you've been creating there.
Oh, I'm so glad, because I've got my chart of the next resource pack here talking about creative ways to approach 1-4-5s. And I've got some really cool ideas for this one. So, hey, if you're listening and you want to check this out, you got to join the piano pack, because that resource is going to be awesome.
Absolutely. We're not afraid to do shameless plugs here on the Musicality podcast. Fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sara. So if you've enjoyed this conversation with Sara Campbell, please do head on over to sarasmusicstudio.com. We'll have a link to that and everything else we've mentioned in the show notes for this episode. Thank you again, Sara.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was great.
Want to know how musical you are and how to improve? Find out free at musicalitypodcast.com/checklist.
Wow, there was a lot of interesting stuff packed into that conversation. I'm sure you can see now why Sara is in such high demand for her teaching. Let's recap the major points we covered there. We started out talking about Sara's nervousness as a singer, how feeling self-conscious of people hearing can mean you need to try and find those quiet moments for practice when there's nobody around to hear you. We talked about the importance of giving yourself that time and the space to be willing to plunk things out and to make mistakes. How we need to remember that childlike mindset of exploring because it's fun to see what you can do instead of worrying about other people judging you for the things you can't do. With piano, she actually didn't feel that self-conscious, and so she was able to freely experiment with playing by ear, and especially with Celtic music. Speaking of which, Sara was kind enough to put together a quick reference sheet for anyone curious about experimenting with Celtic music. Check the show notes for this episode for a link to get that resource for free. Sara shared how she learned the power of visual diagrams for the keyboard. Instead of looking at dots on a music staff in traditional notation, looking at dots on a keyboard layout. This lets you more easily see the relationships between the notes. She gave the example of learning her pentascales and how the visual pattern of black and white notes made it much easier to make sense of it all. Sara is generously providing a quick reference for this too. Check the show notes for details. She went on to study jazz and got thrown in at the deep end of lead sheets, a whole different way of approaching playing keyboard, working just from the melody and the chord symbols. She took that experience to her teaching, where she now helps students begin really early with playing from chord symbols and creating their own arrangements. This really shows that it's never too early or too late to explore this kind of freer music making. Sara gave one great exercise you can try for yourself. Pick a song you love, look up the chord progression on a site like ultimateguitar.com, and experiment with finding your own ways to play it, maybe even in a totally different style. That works great for piano or guitar or other chordal instruments, but if you play a melody instrument like saxophone or trumpet, I think you could do a similar thing with karaoke backing tracks from YouTube and experimenting over the top of them. Sara gave an important warning for this exercise. You won't find it easy the first time. It's totally normal for your first improv to sound not so hot. And that's true even of the people we think of as master improvisers. But the good news is you will get better the more you do it. Now with Upbeat Piano Teachers, and I love that name by the way, do you get the pun? She helps other teachers to bring that creative spirit to their teaching, to connect with young students, and to run a successful piano studio. Every Friday she's now live on the Upbeat Piano Teachers Facebook page. You'll find a link to that in the show notes. We were lucky to land Sara as our resident pro for piano at Musicality, where she does a fantastic job helping our members to apply all of the listening skills we teach in a fun and practical way on piano. If you'd like to learn more about Sara and her various projects, you can check out sarasmusicstudio.com, and that's Sara without a H. And of course, just head to musicalitypodcast.com for the show notes to this episode and links to all of the resources we mentioned. Thanks for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for our next one, where I'll be picking up on this idea of pentascales and talking about how they're different from pentatonic scales and why you might want to add pentascales to your own musical toolbox.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners.